good to see all the attendees here. And of course, I'd like to wish happy 25th birthday for SharePoint. And I'm sure a lot of you are still celebrating. There's events happening. And of course, it's a big weekend for Microsoft, as many of you have probably are aware. 2nd of March, I think, is the event to register if you haven't already. And I think this is it's always an opportunity for me to talk about SharePoint because personally I've been working with SharePoint since 2001. Believe it or not, I think I was going through the chat earlier and I saw some submissions and surveys and things like that, and I think there's quite a few people actually who's been working for a long, long time. So document management has been at the heart of it, really. It's what started out as collaboration, team files management, so forth. And obviously, it's grown into a massive platform to do lots of things. So just want to start by saying also thank you to Pune Tech community as well as M365 Ahmedabad, to all the folks behind the scenes for making this happen, Nandeep, Smita, Kirti, Siddharth, and everybody else. So it's always a pleasure, and I know you guys, we've met in person when I've been in India and a few places. So great to be here. Anyway, so we'll talk about handling Microsoft Teams with document management in SharePoint. So predominantly when we talk about these things, we're always concerned by the user experience, and for me, that's the most important part because whilst the technology is very good, but it's always the user experiences are things that really gets everybody. And for some of us who's been around for a long time in SharePoint, then we know how to navigate and get around it to to get things done. But then if you have any new organizations who have just joined Microsoft 365 platform, or they've been using Teams since the pandemic, or whatever the reasons, they might not be fully aware of all the capabilities within SharePoint, and they'll probably go straight into Teams and potentially create their channels. And when they create their channels, they'll go and create their files and have conversations and then maybe organize meetings and so on. So this session will kind of unpack quite a few things in there just to get total control around it, and also some of the tips and best practices to think about when you're kind of working with your documents, and more importantly, to manage them effectively. I also like to thank the community because over the years I've learned a lot from going to all these events. In fact, I've spoken to all these events in the last 15 plus years. So really thankful to every one of them, the organizers and speakers and everything else. And I love speaking, so hence, I like kind of just getting to get to know people more and so forth. So, love the tech community. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chirag Patel, and in the excuse me, that shouldn't happen. That's what happens when you got clicks and links in your slides. So I live and work in London, and kind of reach out to me on techchirag.com or LinkedIn. Kind of been as I mentioned, been working for a long time, but kind of like 6 years MVP in Teams and Microsoft 365, as well as MCT certified trainer for about 5 years, which basically means that I kind of love talking about things, but I'm also a kind of a consultant working with migrations, mergers and acquisitions, especially the last 5 years, and also working with Microsoft Purview to work with the information protection, retention, and records management. And so my experience over the last 10 years as a contractor consultant has been immense. And I work with a few Microsoft partners to deliver projects for their customers, as well as training for their customers. And I also write my own courses. So that's pretty much what keeps me excited in my day to day, and try and keep up with certifications as well, because we know things are evolving rapidly and changing. So it's good to stay on top of these things when we work with the technology. So that's a bit about me. So yeah, we're gonna look at from this session, as I mentioned, a vast majority of it is some of the building blocks around, what document management is all about. Why do we even care about it? As long as I've got my access to SharePoint sites, I can upload my files or create folders, then that's about it, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there, right? We know, the world is a lot more bigger when we talk about managing our files and other content within that SharePoint. So we'll kind of cover those things. And then, of course, you have, what we call, how to look after our house of documentation, because having files or lists by itself is not enough, because we want to give some context about those files. And so we kind of then get into talking about how best to classify some of this information, and also being able to appropriately organize those files or folders subject to the business needs, requirements, compliance requirements, all those things we have to take into consideration before we even think about how to organize such information. So we'll cover some of those things, and then also keeping in mind that we don't create the documents just for the sake of it. We don't keep them there forever. So we have to think about the information governance and the protection capabilities, so that we don't land a fine from the regulatory bodies, or we don't want to leak out our documents if they're confidential, for example. So all those things has to be thought through for a effective document management. So, very briefly, I always use this slide, whenever I have to answer a question, what exactly is SharePoint? It kind of, in my sort of world, I mean, it kind of does the five things really. Predominantly, a lot of it is working with files, but also it does pages, and every SharePoint site has a home page. But of course, you can build other solutions such as intranets or any other applications which may require more pages and sorts of things. So you can build those pages too. You can build lists, or import them from your Excel spreadsheets, and then bring it into your SharePoint, potentially as a web tables, if you like, which you can manage and track and add comments to it and all sorts of things, formatting, and just to kind of improve those collaboration experiences for your users. You have, obviously, the big part of it is, of course, managing SharePoint sites, right? So potentially you can have a site for your departments, you can have a site for your projects, you can have a site for any special work you're doing, whether that's managing contracts, whatever it is, whatever the topic is. You can potentially create your sites based on those needs, and you have a limit of, around 2 million, if you like, in your tenants. So there's plenty of opportunities to be able to work with those things, and we'll obviously uncover, why would you create some of these things and for what reasons, and then hopefully you can have that informed decision to work out exactly what to sort of create. And then, of course, customizations. There's a huge community out there. I mean, of course, Nish Kalank just earlier today, and just this previous session, he talked about some of the permission handling scenarios. Of course, Siddharth, Nandip, these guys are also developing things too, right? So there's a PnP community. So, you can customize your entire SharePoint to meet all the experiences that you want, or build web parts or whatever it is. So SharePoint framework, a lot of it is kind of that powers up all this development. So you have the huge potential there to kind of get the most out of your SharePoint. Okay, so why document management, right? I mean, typically, yeah, we kind of, we talk about things like, when we cover from a simplest of the file experiences, files, folders that we work with it, that's great. It could be maybe that you've migrated your content from a different content management systems, so you kind of want to, bring that into here, and kind of, hopefully, keep a consistent structure. Of course, there's different types of documents you're working with, personnel records, application forms, financial accounts, whatever it is, right? All these things you want to think about, or at least think about ongoing as your journey to try and work out what types of documents these are, in particular, how do they relate to the tasks that you're part of, which might be part of the overall business process, right? So when you think about those things, you then effectively you want to kind of try to work out how best to bring your document design capabilities into the motion. Of course, we talk about things like metadata, right? Metadata, data about your files, that context elements of it. So all these things we have to think about, that what kind of columns within a SharePoint document library we could create, so that we can give the options to the users, or maybe automate that so that we can fill out all the necessary information about that type of files that we have. And then, of course, you think about your planning of your sites, departments, projects, or work groups, whatever it is, and then you can template those things, right? So, that can basically then be able to kind of manage the provisioning of it, but also have some themes to it as to what kind of information goes where, so that it's easier for the users to be able to navigate the solutions. So at the topmost level, typically SharePoint site is what you would create, right? And there's a number of ways of creating for example, a team site, whether that's within your SharePoint homepage, could be within your Outlook, some Teams planner. So there's different ways for creating your SharePoint. And this is the top level where, of course, you want to make sure that you have that security boundary, which is typically what's one of the criteria that separates from one site to another, so that you want to make sure the right people have access to the right information within that site. And of course, if you do go into Microsoft Teams, you create your new Teams chat space, for example, that's going to create a SharePoint site in the background, because of course that's where the heart of the content is. So, once you create your site, then you kind of, as the life of the journey goes for any SharePoint sites, it's got a homepage, it's got at least one document library. And of course, if it's a Teams connected one, you can add Teams to it, so that of course, you can, connect that experiences together, so then you can start seeing files that are in your channels appear in your uh, folders within your main document library. And of course, not everything is limited to your internal users. So you might want to open up that SharePoint site to allow external sharing based on your policies. So you can do those things very quickly, and then of course, depending on your needs for your users and the information that you're holding, you can then think about posting some updates through the news pages, or you can synchronize your documents to your desktop using your OneDrive application. And then you might go on to create lists and track information and so forth. And you have some integrations in there with Power Apps, Power Automate, and forms and all these things. So you can start to sort of bring that automation and creating applications as well to be able to target SharePoint content that you have. So as a user, you have all these tools, all these features and capabilities to really kind of improve that whole document management side of things as well. And then of course you can integrate with lots of other applications. So this is it's a very quick sort of rundown as to how you can quickly enrich your team side. You might not use all the features, that's okay, but at least for those of you who are new to this, that at least you know roughly what this potentially might look like. Very briefly, from a team's perspectives, where when I see a lot of organizations, there are a lot of group chats people have, they have the conversations that goes on, share a few files between them, and a lot of those files will go and live inside their OneDrives. Whoever's shared the file, their files will live in their OneDrive, right? Of course, the main advocacy here is that SharePoint ideally should be where your all your corporate data is stored and managed. Um, and of course, as Teams are a big part of Microsoft 365 group, that's where you can have all those Teams, mail communications, and all those things with its own security membership. But then, of course, when you look at within the OneDrive, it's far too easy to navigate as well to it because when you're within Teams, you got the OneDrive in your application bar, right? So as a Teams user, you might not think about SharePoint directly because it's not really visible as per se when you're in Teams. But what's visible is that OneDrive itself. So people might think, oh, it's OneDrive, I can store my files there, and then suddenly their corporate data is now being stored in OneDrive. So, just think about those kind of experiences when you're working with those kind of files in that respect. What I would suggest as a kind of one of the best practices is that personally, when I work with teams, and as part of that teams, when we get the default document library, tend to keep that library just purely for the collaboration purposes and all the channels you might have in Microsoft Teams. So all that is in one place. But as soon as you want to create some structured document management libraries, with its metadatas and maybe even content types. We'll talk about some of these things a bit later. Then you want to think about creating an additional document libraries, right? So that it's carefully managed, it's carefully, applied with the appropriate permissions, and of course, the whole separation of collaboration versus document management can become a lot more easy to manage. So I would share that, and I'm sure a lot of you, when you're working with SharePoint, who's been around for a longer time, will probably agree with me on that, that you want to try and keep these things as structured as possible. General document flows before, of course, you can always start with OneDrive, to have, if you have any ideas or whatever or if you have access to SharePoint, great, that becomes your starting point too. But the general ethos is that you're kind of creating it, editing it, circulating it by sharing it, and then once you think there is enough momentum, or at least there's enough context around those files, whether it's a project or an idea, then you can start thinking about moving that into SharePoint. So all these functionality you have within connecting between OneDrive and SharePoint is far easy to manage. So think about that collaboration experiences because the document management still is very much part of this overall experiences in there. Yeah. So just before I go into the demo parts, right? Just want to quickly run by, if, for those of you, what potentially your structure could look like, So most organizations have some kind of a corporate communication or, strategic communication tooling. Either it's called the intranet or maybe some workplace tool or whatever it is. And hopefully you're using SharePoint. If you're not, that's another solution you can think about having as an intranet in your SharePoint-based intranet in your Microsoft 365 environment. But typically, you'll have those, let's say those department SharePoint sites. You're not limited by those, of course. You can have functional SharePoint sites too, whatever the hierarchy you decide based on your information architecture. So, you might say you'll have HR part side, finance SharePoint side, and then within an internal communications, you might have, some particular teams for different types of conversations you might have, and they indirectly, of course, will have their own SharePoint side such as communications or supplier services, depending on the works that they're doing. And of course, each of these things will have its own set of permissions. So from the left, you'll have pretty much everybody in your organization who will have access to it. As you kind of go towards the right, and you're kind of securing your content by applying permissions to a small select of users, in some cases maybe to even specific document libraries or a folder or whatever. So think about that sort of flow of your structures when you're creating your content within these sites. Of course, when you do end up having a lot of SharePoint sites, the world is flat, right? As they say, or at least in Microsoft's world, when we are deploying SharePoint sites. So we, of course, sometimes want to be able to relate to these things. So we have this kind of feature capabilities called hub sites. So we tend to organize our SharePoint sites based on the works that we're doing or based on the location, whatever those needs are. You can bring then those group of SharePoint sites together, right? So in this case, where there's the engineering, for example, which have got, works that they do with the design, with the research, building solutions, features. Each of these blue bubbles, they're SharePoint sites in its own right because there will be specific teams working with different types of content, materials, whatever it is. And so they tend to bring all this together by connecting to the engineering SharePoint site. So same thing with Europe, you might have a company with multiple offices and each of those offices have their teams and managers. So you can bring those teams together by connecting with the in this case Europe sales. So there's no real hard and fast rules in terms of what is the starting point and end point, right? As long as you're able to relate things, bring it together, and you can always move things around, especially if one department merges with another department, you can move these things very easily without affecting the security. And the biggest benefit here is that you're able to bring what we call the navigation experiences for connecting all these SharePoint sites in one place. So if you're in, say, if I'm in Europe sales area, I can get to my content very easily for London, Paris, and so on. But then if I'm in a London SharePoint site, then I can also go back to Europe sales very easily and still be able to navigate around Paris, Athens, and so on. So, you have that flexibility with navigation. And then, of course, you can bring files. I say bring, you can surface the files through your web parts within your SharePoint pages to be able to bring files from different SharePoint sites all in one place. So all that management experiences of your files becomes a lot more easier. Yeah. So let's have a quick look because I kind of talked enough around some of those things. So, this typically, that's the landing page. From it here, you kind of go to your SharePoint. If those of you who go to it, if I go to my say the project side, which is I'll just put it type. It's probably easier. Like so no different, it's a standard team site, it's kind of got a few document libraries in them and, kind of navigation on the left-hand side. I've of course got Microsoft 365 Copilot, so, I've got my knowledge agent there as well, so I can ask questions and all the, the generative AI capabilities. But typically when you go into here, I mean, this particular site is not connected to anything at all, right? If I head back to my admin SharePoint site on the admin center to have a quick look at my SharePoint sites, I can then, of course, start to kind of build things out from there to be able to say, well, if I want to make the client-based SharePoint site here, I can make this into a hub if I wanted to. So I could go into my management setting for active sites, and then I can go and say, either make this hub. Now, in this case, it's already registered as a hub, so that's okay. But if I didn't want to, I could still edit my hub site settings. So that's the basic functionality there, which I can then manage who can connect to my client hub sites if I wanted to invite people and so forth, right? So you can manage that behavior of your sites in that sort of ways for from a hub site perspective. Um, the other part, if I go into my project side, which is where I was earlier, so let's go back to the project side. And so project side, if I wanted to connect to that very client because the project is part of the client side itself, then I can just quickly go into site information and then select my hub site association, which is what client was one of them. So I can just go and pick to the client itself. Yeah. Um, Talked about earlier on that if I want to enable my information governance protection mechanisms because I've got my sensitivity labels, which is one of the features you get in Microsoft Purview as part of your general information protection, then I can pick my sensitivity labels right from here in this SharePoint site so that I can make sure that this project is a very highly confidential SharePoint site. And behind this label, there are a set of configurations, policies that says, do not share externally. There might be some added permissions added to this label itself in which people can actually use this. So I can define all that in Microsoft Purview, and your compliance administrators will be aware of those capabilities. So as a user, I can then pick and say, right, this site is going to be a highly confidential itself. So like that, I can just go and save that site information so that this SharePoint site, the project, you can see all of a sudden that's changed to bring my client. I haven't got much navigation there, but I can define that. And then, of course, I can see that my project now is connected to my client-based hub site. And that way I can then go into this experience to bring about the files in different sites of client and project in one place if I wanted to. And also you can see there that because I've connected the sensitivity label, so now I've got this saying private project, private group, highly confidential. So very kind of easy in that sense. And that's what shouldn't happen there. But that kind of that's the basic starting point from your site points of view. So once you've got your SharePoint site in there, then of course you want to think about what you're going to be creating. So of course I mentioned things like document library, which is the default one you get. Very easily you can just go and click on document library and then start creating your files for your from your document management perspective, pages, news post, and so forth. So all that is very easily created from there. Yeah. Some of the structures within as far as your information architecture is concerned, things to think about is, as I mentioned, metadata. That's probably one of the key building blocks, really, when you think about these things. But of course, people are happy to create folders, because they might not know anything about the metadata, the columns, content types, and they'll just say, "Well, I know where my files are. I know how to get to it, so I'll just do that." And there's nothing wrong with that. Great. But in the long run, we are talking about the efficiency of it. We want to try and improve the search experiences. And of course, in turn of doing that, of course, the co-pilot experiences too, right? So the more metadata we have, the content types, the easier it becomes for this content to be retrieved in variety of ways. You also have document sets. I mean, this has been around for a long time, so they're kind of special folder, if you like, right? But the key difference there is that when you start using your metadata, then essentially at the folder level, you really can't have the metadata that has all your files within them. You can only apply your metadata at the file levels. The document sets improves this capability in a huge way, right? So, for example, think about an example could be a property. If you're in a property management business and you're creating a property for, your portfolio, you might create some metadata that's called maybe a property manager, a property region, or whatever it is. And you can define that at that document set level, and then any files you're uploading to it, they all inherit potentially that metadata. So you're kind of reducing the need to tag every time what the metadata should be. So again, that's something to think about, that capability to be able to work with. Views, your files starts to add up. They become hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, whatever it is, right? So it helps to then start to sort and filter some of these files. And by doing that, you can then create your views so that the user can get to those files very quickly and easily based on the views you define. And typically, every document library you have, you'll get all documents view by default anyway. So again, think about that experience too. And then of course web parts, which essentially are the widgets of what lives on the pages of SharePoint. So that kind of makes up the experience of what you see on your documents, on your SharePoint pages. And that those web parts could be your sites, your highlighted content, which will basically bring files from potentially a select SharePoint sites. And there are far more other third-party web parts too that you can bring into it as well. Search, I know the story of search continues, especially with Copilot around. It's still always very tricky, from a user's point of view. If you're using Copilot, great, you can ask anything about your SharePoint site through the knowledge agent, and you'll potentially get all the answers you need, right? But there are cases where you might want to define your search and configuration experiences. And for that, you could introduce things like having bookmarks. You can have answers, right? So when users search for these things in their SharePoint, you could proactively give them the search results that what you might think what they might be looking for. So those things can be defined within Microsoft admin area through going to the search and being able to sort of work with that. And then, of course, you got the compliance and retention because generally if you like, the holy trinity of information architecture is all about findability, usability, and the compliance, right? Think of that as a triangle, right? So when you come up with a design of your sites and structures, think about this ingredients to be able to bring that into it. Okay, so let's have a look. So if we shift the gears from here, right, a bit more than files, then we start getting into to understand some of the capabilities around content types and metadata, right? So content types, think of them as your potentially as your templates for the common types of documents you're always creating. So in this case, you have your content type that pulls together, which is what we call an item, which is essentially a content type. And then we have the information about that content type in form of these columns. So what we're trying to do is we're bringing a content type called, say, a sales contract, and we're bringing all the information about it in form of the metadata, which is in this case salesperson, client company, or purchase order numbers. So, these things you can bring together so that if you're working with many types of documents in your document library, then you can ensure that only the right level of metadata is going to be filled in for the right type of the files. Because if you have an IT contract or anything like that, you might have some different fields for that, right? You might have the technology, for example, that's concerned with that IT contract. So you might have technology as a column. So so you can be selective around those things, but then also you can actually inherit some of these content types. The base content types in SharePoint, typically they tend to be item, and then of course you have document that's built on top of the item itself. But then you might have your organization document, and then any document types you create, you might create in form of your documents that we have within your types that you've defined. So contract, design documents, you can have as many as you like, but start with little and then grow naturally with that to be able to bring your columns into it. So that entire experience lives either at a global level. So typically you will go into your SharePoint admin center or your SharePoint administrator will, um, and then you will ensure that all that content types is kind of replicated all the way down to your SharePoint site so that users can start using it, right? So let's have a look at what that looks like. Yeah. So if I'm in my SharePoint site here, which let me pick which was the one that I've got that into it. Um, I go in the property management. Let me try project. Pretty sure that I've got that in there. So if I go to documents, document library, I'm just thinking if I got content type, I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah, I have. So, okay, good morning. Hi, Sal. That's a lovely morning. Hey, no worries. Good to see you, Rashmi. Um, So you have typically your user will go and create your documents, and then of course you'll pick your files and so on. But here in my drop-down options, you can see I've got sales contract, and that's something that I have defined for my organization so that anybody who comes in this document library, they can go and click on say sales contract, and it will go and open up a template and start working with their documents, right? So that's the kind of experience we're trying to achieve. And of course, you can see here that I've got a few files there. So, if I pick this PowerPoint DG product overview, on the right-hand side, I've got salesperson, client company. If I expand that details, then I will have only just those fields there based on the uh, content type that I have. Now, you'll see that I can't see my sales manager or client, which is the two attributes I have, and that's because the content type here it says is a document, right? So I can change that to say, well, this is going to be that PowerPoint file is my sales contract. As a user, I can do that, and as soon as I change that, I can now see the dynamically salesperson and client company now appears. So making it very tight, specific to that document type itself that I want to. So a couple of ways of doing that is, if we look at behind the scenes, is that I would go into my SharePoint Admin Center and go into this area of content services. And then I could go into content type gallery, which you have the whole set of out of the box content types. You can scroll down to your heart's content. But basically, I created my sales contract by going through here in the create content type. So if I go to my sales contract, content type, just to show you there, then I can see that in particularly what's interesting is the site columns there at the bottom right. So there I've got my title, salesperson, and for some reason part of my screen is cut off. Why is that? Okay, never mind. You'll have to take it from me. There's salesperson and the client in there. So those things I've defined it through the site columns. And the idea behind is this, that when I create my site columns, right, behind the scenes is creating what we call the managed properties as well for this search to be more powerful, right? So these things are getting created for you in the background. If I create new site columns, for example, just to kind of give you an idea, then what I can do is maybe not from here. If I go to my other SharePoint site, because you might create a columns here, which may have different types of content as well. So there you will have text choices, dates, multiple lines, and all these things. So again, depending on what your needs are, you might choose different type of columns to capture that key piece of information about that metadata. So once you create your content type in your SharePoint Admin Center here, you can then go ahead and say publish that change, right? And again, you might come back again and say, you know what, now we need to add another column to this sales content type. If you do that, you come back here, add that column, republish that change, and then that change goes in there. So that wiring is quite good to bring about that user experience who can then pick up the SharePoint site, the sales contract, sorry, document type within that site. Yeah. Any questions from anybody so far on this? And I appreciate in the time that I have trying to go through the entire document management experiences, but hopefully you can see how these Lego pieces come together, right? Some of us have been doing this for a living for many, many years, so we love it. Okay, good. I see some few thumbs up, so that's always nice to kind of see how it is. Great. Mentioned about the document management, the governance side of things. This is probably one of the key parts. And again, I'm not going to go into the great depths for each of these things. And this is only three of many solutions within your Microsoft purview. Of course, you have, in addition to managing your retention and deletion sensitivity labels, you also have things to consider like insider risk management, right? You also got things like e-discovery. So if you have a litigation or investigation, so you have to be able to query a lot of these things very easily in that part of as well. So again, think about that from your user perspective. The only thing I'm going to mention here is that if I was to go into my purview, and I appreciate this is not a purview session, which is the M365 compliance tool, then basically what you need to think about whenever you go through your information architecture, and depending on what you've come up with as a design in terms of your sites, you probably want to think about what's that going to look like from a compliance administrator's view, right? Because if I go into this solution, data lifecycle management, which is where I would sort of create my retention or records, well, retention labels in this case and policies, I would create my record labels in records management module, but that's not the point here anyway. So if I go to policies, try and create a retention policy, and kind of just quickly step through the wizard there, then I can see here, what I will see is that if I click on the locations aspects of it, I will get on the right-hand side what I call all these things, all sites and all user accounts and all M365 groups. And that's important, right? Because if you've decided to use only few SharePoint sites to kind of store all your content to it, there's no easy way for the compliance administrator to be able to pick various SharePoint sites, right? Because he or she might go into here and say, you know what, I'm going to apply to all my groups, mailboxes, and sites because they are connected, right? And they might go into here and click edit. But what they might see is just 12 odd SharePoint sites. And I come across this a lot of the times. If you have a department site, people put all their folders and files into it. Then you're creating yourself more work to manage the compliance, which means that you'll have to go at the document library level, folder level to start setting some defaults, and it becomes messy very, very quickly. So always think about having your document management related sites as separate as possible. So it's very easy to then sort of target your retention labels because you might want to store, in this case, let's say solar project, you might want to store that for 10 years. Whereas the Everest, for example, you might want to store that for 5 years, right? So, think about those things, how best to separate in there. So it's the same category as well for your sensitivity labels and all those things. So I thought I'll just quickly mention those things very easily. The other capabilities you have, just looking at time-wise, want to make sure we don't run out of that time. So SharePoint Advanced Management, because we're dealing with a lot of this, uh, especially with for organizations who are embarking on Microsoft 365 Copilot. I know it's been around for a couple of years now, and some organizations are still a bit nervous, whether to kind of allow for all your sites because, in essence, your co-pilot is only going to get information based on your user permissions. So it's you who's driving the co-pilot experience. So if you got access to so many SharePoint sites, Copilot is going to bring all that to you. So, that could include some surprises too. That's just the design of your security and permissions. So there are some tools and policies that you could sort of go through this to try and understand how best to be able to navigate some of these things. So, if I go to my admin site here again, for SharePoint. And because I've got this Copilot license, you only need one Copilot license to be able to sort of access that. Then you will see at the bottom there, I've got advanced management option there. So it's a very good tool. You want to sort of start the assessment, you can kind of go into that SharePoint Advanced Management to try and understand what's the state of play that looks like in your tenant for your SharePoint. So in this case, I've got 9 SharePoint sites that has got, so that needs attention to it. It could be maybe, in this case, I've got 9 sites that has showing as site inactivity, right? And this is important, right? Because if you're going to create sites, you're going to store files, and if you're not going to use it, who's keeping an eye on it? These things sometimes don't get looked after properly. So this is a good way to have a look as to what's going on. And then you can see the recommendations in this case for the site inactivity. You can download that report to have a look at what it is. It could be maybe, there's no owners or whatever, right? And you could then quickly create an inactive site policy as well, so that you can say, if the site is inactive, I can just go and create a policy just like that, go through the wizard and so forth to be able to kind of notify the owners based on what they might want to send the policies. So, that's the sort of things you want to kind of think about when it comes to using your SharePoint Advanced Resources. And then a couple of other things in there. If I look at all features, you can have things like, look at, what's sort of happening, put conditional access policies to it, access restrictions, site level access restriction. That's probably a good one there, because there you might have organization-wide setting, which you might want to think about to limit those things. Again, there's whole lots of things in there to look at from that point of view, on that. So, I mean, that was a quick sort of rundown, if you like, of the SharePoint side of things. There's of course a lot more materials on the Microsoft Learn, some good guidances, some good scripts and things as well available to get you up and sort of maintaining it, or if you're new, then start running it from those things. And of course, do consider what we call the governance of your environment. Who creates what, how does it get managed, and how does it get looked after. So all those things are very, very important. But I hope that's given you a bit of a flavor of all the structures within your site when it comes to looking at your document management. Of course, there is the added capabilities from a document processing point of view, formerly Microsoft Syntax. So if you're working at the large scale documents, templates, metadata you want to create, you can create models for your documents and all those things. And that takes you to far more further than what I've shown you here with the out of the box basic capabilities. So with that, thank you very much for staying with me, and thanks to Nandip and Siddharth and everybody else for organizing this event. Wishing you happy SharePoint 25th birthday. I will be very fortunate and privileged to even deliver a session at the Microsoft 365 Community Conference in Orlando next month, which I know they want to celebrate there. I've already seen ESPC in Dublin just a few months ago. So yeah, everything to celebrate for. So I hope to see some of you there. If not, maybe some other event online too. So any questions, fire away or ask me in the chat. But yeah, thanks again, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much, Chirag.